So let's begin. Tonight's author before she began her long career as an English professor at Santa Barbara City College, she spent a year teaching on a Fulbright grant in Cyprus, island of Aphrodite. Fascination with ancient Greece deepened while exploring archaeology and museums of the island and led to her in-depth studies of mythology and Greek tragedy. And eventually, this novel, revealing the enigmatic story of Tiresias. Please welcome Jinny Webber.
Thank you all so much for coming, and you're more than welcome. I'm going to take us all to Bronze Age Greece, which is where the book is set, and I brought a couple of things as little introducgeno's. They're both Minoan. Okay, so you've probably seen this image before. This is the serpent god. She's not the goddess, priestess. She's a serpent priestess in the Minoan culture. And my book, it takes place between the Minoans. Their culture has been destroyed in Crete. It's been pretty much destroyed. There's some remnants, but both basically between the earthquakes and floods and fires and everything, that just brought an end to it. And there's not a whole lot known about them except what is known I'll get to pretty soon. But they fled to Mycenaean Greece. But the one thing, the mainland Greece across, it's the Long Island of Greece. So but they had these kinds of images that you just don't find in Greece, and this kind of clothing. So then the other thing I brought, also typical of the Minoans, and you'll find out why I mentioned it, but this is a hand-painted vase copying a Minoan vase. And what's interesting about this is it's all just beautiful images from nature. They did not have any evidence of warfare in Crete. There was just no fortifications, no weaponry, no images of anything except lily prints and frolicking children and so on. And this just gives you an idea of the joy of that culture, because there are remnants of that still existing in this story. Anyway, so Bronze Age Greece is roughly from 1500 BC, and the Trojan War happened at roughly in around 1200 BC, and then it got written down by Homer in around 800 BC. Those are just general rough dates. My book takes place actually 3 generations before the Trojan War. So it would be around 1350 BC, roughly. I have to say something about time. Mythic time and real time aren't exactly the same. So some people say Tiresias, lived 900 years because he pops up in different stories. Well, the time is present but not specific exactly. So we won't worry about that too much. It's mythic time. It's all in another era. I had to write about times with completely different beliefs than our own and make them feel real. So what happened that got me so interested in Bronze Age Greece was what Michael referred to, the Fulbright year that we spent my then husband and I spent, both of us, teaching in Cyprus. And there had recently been troubles there, and there were, while we were between the Greeks and the Turks, and there were, while we were there, I think, the church would explode or something, things would happen bad, but they didn't seem to bother us. The wonderful thing about this year was we were both teaching, but we had weekends free. And so we covered every inch of that island. And in the time that we were there was a division between the Greeks and the Turks. Today, the Greek part is the larger part, and Greek Cyprus is a separate country. The Turkish part, the Turks were partitioned off to the north. They had been in the north before, but they'd also been elsewhere. They're all in the north now, and that's a property of Turkey. So there's a real border, you might say, between the two. In order to go from the Greek to the Turkish center, you have section. You have to go through some kind of permissions, not fully visa, but anyway, you have to prove that you're not a troublemaker, I guess, or something. I'm not sure. I suppose I flashed my passport. I can't remember. But when we were, recently when I went, but back then, we were told that we shouldn't drive around the island without a UN escort. But we had a school-age son and 2 little tow-headed blonde children, girls, and And no one's going to bother us cruising around. And so we just went everywhere. We saw all the ruins, archaeological sites, at least once, possibly more. We went everywhere, so often the only ones there. And the special place that I remembered that actually there's a scene kind of inspired by it in my book was down near Paphos in the south, where all of Cyprus is so different. Has anyone been to Cyprus within the last 10 or 15 years? Well, it's very touristic. The whole southern coast is all tourist hotels. There's little isolated places if you know where to look, but basically it's not at all what it was when we were there. And the village we lived in outside Nicosia is just now part of the big suburban city of Nicosia. But back in those days, we wandered near Paphos to this meadow, and there was a sacred spring to Aphrodite in the meadow. And then the meadow was said to be, there weren't really any guides at these sites or placards or anything, but there were books you could find and get a little history. So I read up on things. And this meadow was considered the meadow of Adonis, because Aphrodite, Venus to the Romans, had an affair, loved this beautiful young mortal man called Adonis. And of course she was afraid because mortals die, and so she begged him not to go hunting. But being a headstrong young man, of course he does, and he gets gored by a wild boar. They're pretty ferocious and pretty big, and he dies. But the tradition was that once a year Adonis comes back for a week. And so this was supposedly the meadow where he came back by the spring, and it was sprinkled with anemones for drops of his blood. And so they had this thing. And I don't know, there's something about that meadow. The whole thing just really caught my imagination. At that time, I was familiar with mythology, but not all that much. Not in great detail. I just knew the stories. I don't think I even knew the story of Tiresias, probably until I read the Metamorphosis as a sophomore at UCSB, and English majors had to take a course, and I read the Odyssey and the Greek plays, few Greek plays, Metamorphosis, read a few things. The Metamorphosis is by Ovid. I have to say this is a wonderful translation, and Chaucer's carries it, Charles Martin. It's not the one I read read first time round, but I'm going to read you the story of Tiresias in here. It's very brief. It's not long in any translation. And somehow that story, when I came across it in the Metamorphosis, I thought, what if that really was a human person? All these supernatural things happen to a real human being. And I kind of wanted to write about that, but I didn't ever do it. So when my kids went off to college, I went back to UCSB, and I mentioned that I got this PhD in religious studies. And I said to Michael, I don't think it has anything to do with the book, so you don't need to mention it, because I thought, well, this book is entertainment. It's a story. It's not scholarly. So I didn't want, people to think that anyway, I decided that actually there were two influences of that PhD that were important. And one was just reading about the Minoans. The only course I took at all related, if any of you were around UCSB in those years, there was this wonderful man called Raimundo Panicar, and he taught a course in religious studies called Cross-Cultural Approaches to Peace. And of all things, he let me write about the Minoans. I didn't think he would, because so little is known. I'm writing about more or less mythic people. He let me, and for the reasons I was telling you, that they were so peace-loving. And then I found out that they did have evidence of a mother goddess tradition and all kinds of interesting things that kind of balanced out Zeus and Apollo and Ares, the god of war, and all of those Greek things that we know about. So that was all pretty interesting to me. But the other benefit was that I just had to write a full-length work. You write a dissertation and you write 400 pages. So I thought, all my life, I'd love to write. I wrote poems and short stories. I'm like, I can write a novel. And the novel that popped up was Tiresias. So that was a very long time ago. I had the whole first draft finished. It was actually 2 at that time. His time as a woman and as her, and this time as a man, but it's all one now. So, anyway, what I was going to do is read Ovid's version of this myth, so you'll know what I was working with, and why it was so puzzling, if you want to think of this happening to a real person. Okay, So, Ovid, of course, I think I mentioned, if I didn't, he was Latin. He was living right at the turn between the BC and the Christian era, right in that time. Christianity had not come to Rome. It wasn't anywhere near it for a couple centuries. But they did have different names for the gods. They pretty much adopted Greek gods. They loved having Greek slaves because they were so smart and educated and all this, so, but they took their same gods basically. So it's Jove and Juno here. However, in my book I use all the Greek names, so it would be Zeus and Hera. And then he says Saturn's daughter, that would be Cronos' daughter. But, I'm not going to change it. This is how Ovid wrote it. In this translation, however, okay. Meanwhile, they say that in heaven, Jove had put aside his weighty cares and, drink in hand, was busy killing time in repartee with Juno. Women get far more pleasure out of sex than men do, he said. And when she denied this, they both agreed to seek the arbitration of the transsexual sage Tiresias, who, in a leafy forest, had once profaned the coupling of two enormous serpents by giving them a blow with his walking stick. A wonder, for at that moment, at once he was transformed into a woman, and remained as such for 7 years. But when the 8th year came, this is in every translation. I don't read Latin since 9th grade, but they all say he. Obviously, she's been a woman, so it's a she anyway. But the 8th year came, she saw the same two serpents once again and said, "Since striking you has the effect of turning one into one's opposite, I'll strike you once again." And having done so, became the image of his former self. The sage agreed to settle their dispute, a trifling one, or so he must have thought, when he agreed with Jove. But Saturn's daughter, Juno, reacted badly when he gave his judgment, and many thought her anger was excessive. I didn't read that anywhere. I just think that's adorable. They thought her anger was excessive when, for an issue of no great importance, she damned Tiresias to eternal blindness. But one god can't undo another's doing. So Jove gave Tiresias the gift of foresight to replace the vision lost, tempering punishment with the high esteem he was soon held in throughout all of Boeotia, and that's the province of Greece where Thebes is located, for the unerring answers that he gave to those who came and sought his counsel. So that was the story, augmented by the Greek plays, Sophocles in particular, with his Oedipus plays, but there are other ones as well. There's loads of names of Greek plays that never survived. So a lot of people wrote about the story of Oedipus, but the one that came down to us is the trilogy by Sophocles. Anyway, so there's more to the story, but that's the essence of it. So I had that to work with, and I thought, well, first question that started me writing the book was, why did he say that? What happened during those 7 years as a woman that made him say that? And of course, the whole thing's a joke. In my book, it's to Jove and Juno, to Zeus and Hera. It's a joke, more or less. They, in my book, I say they were nectar-fueled argument, because the gods don't drink wine. Actually, they drink nectar and eat ambrosia. So they were drunk and having this joke. But it did affect Tiresias forever. But he does become a seer. And being a seer really meant something in this era. When we put ourselves back into Bronze Age Greece, we become aware that the gods were very involved in people's lives. If you read the Iliad, you see the gods take sides. They even enter in. Aphrodite saves her favorite Paris. Thetis talks to Odysseus, mostly in the Odyssey, but still, the gods are just right there. And when we look at early cultures, and that's true of indigenous cultures of all sorts, dream world and dream time in Australia and so on, there's a thinner barrier somehow between mundane reality and the supernatural, or something beyond, on the other side of that veil or that barrier. And they just can move back and forth easily. Or it's present. It's just present in a way in their lives. And you see that through prophets. There's no record of any prophet speaking wrong. The gods speak to prophets. Tiresias, every one of his prophecies was right when he is in high esteem as a people seeking his counsel. In other words, a soothsayer. They get the truth. The Delphic oracle never lied. When there was the Athenians were fighting the Persians, they got an oracle for the Greek troops how that they should stop the Persians. You know, I won't go into that. You can read about it yourself. But anyway, that is true. So, so what I was interested in was getting the human side in an era where that was the case. And soothsayers were valuable in Rome all the way up, we know from the play Julius Caesar, you know, beware the Ides of March. When the soothsayer says that to Caesar, he's right. Caesar's going to get killed in the Ides of March, that March 15th. So, anyway, all of that got suppressed as cults and witchery and so on. White magic did extend into the Middle Ages, but pretty much it got suppressed. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about real quick is the oral tradition, because that is extremely important for all the literature that we have from Greece, from, you know, the epics, everything. And I did go on 2 writing retreats. I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but I started this book all that long time ago, set it aside. And part of the reason I set it aside is because I didn't know how to sell it, for one thing, and I had no clue and didn't know where to send it. Someone knew the sister-in-law of a New York publisher. I sent it to the sister-in-law, someone with Farrar Straus, I think it was Strauss's wife or something. I don't know. Whatever. That it was not the way to get a publisher, and I never knew how, so I quit. Set it aside. I was busy teaching at City College, but they started sending me on study abroads to England, so I got very interested in Shakespeare and the theater. So the 3 novels I actually wrote that were published were all about that. And Bedtrick is the 3rd. It stands alone. And they do have a couple copies, and I put some cards there if you're interested. If you're more interested in Shakespeare and Greece, or interested in both. I happen to be interested in both. But anyway, back to the oral tradition. When I went back to the book, I went on this writing retreat in Cyprus, just up in a village right above Paphos, which was nice. Aphrodite was born with the sea foam right below, not where we went swimming. We had a cove, it was too rough and ready up where she got born, supposedly. But anyway, as I was sitting there trying to figure out how I was going to bring this book back to life that had been sitting for, you know, more than a decade. I had looked at it now and then and played with it. I thought, well, I should have Tiresias tell his story, because he's had this weird life that nobody knows about. He's kept it secret that for 7 years he was a woman, and all the things that happened. And so I won't go into why, but anyway, his daughter, he tells it to his daughter. In mythology, Tiresias had 3 daughters: Manto, Historis, and Daphne. And Historis supposedly delivered Hercules on a shield. So that's mythic time. You know, that's way back in some other time that doesn't even exist in my book. But anyway, I still put it in there because she did. But Manto and Daphne were both sibyls or oracles in Delphi. But Manto only for a little while. And then she went on and did other things. And then she is credited with having composed the Thebaid, which was an epic, which only survives in pieces, fragments, that predated Homer. But it's all mythical, kind of. I mean, no one really knows, but that's who they say wrote this thing that we just have pieces of. And so that gave me a reason that not only is Tiresias going to talk about his female time, but also the story of Oedipus, because that's the Thebaid, is that Oedipus, his 2 battling sons, their sons, the cousins battling each other, subject of other Greek plays. So I had to fit that in a way. He's going to tell her that too. So that's the second part of the book. The first part is called Grace Unveiled, and that comes from a line in Sappho, unveil your grace to me. And the second is riddling the Sphinx, because Oedipus also riddled the Sphinx. Okay, so that's the oral tradition then is living in this, because that's how the stories survived so long before they ever got written down. All right, so I'm going to read the first transformation scene. I have 2 of them in here, but this is the first one, and I'll skip a little bit. I'll tell you just the briefest of setups, which is that Teresia's wife just died. She died in childbirth, she already has Manto, she's a 2-year-old, and she gives birth to the child, the daughter that becomes the Storas, but she dies in childbirth. And he feels he's responsible because he kind of gave her a push, and she had, more or less a miscarriage or premature birth or whatever. Anyway, he's feeling horrible. So this is the morning after, and he's feeling really horrible. He just... At dawn, I stumbled out the door. A sleepwalker's trance took me through the city gate. I noticed nothing until I found myself walking on dry pine needles beyond all human paths. Sticky webs brushed my face and caught in my hair, and branches pushed against me. I swept them aside with my staff and walked on. Chill silence startled me. I caught a wild smell, a dread surrounding presence. The deep wood's raw odor overwhelmed my senses. At my feet, gnarled roots came to life, a ripple of blue on copper. No! 2 serpents writhed before me in a primal dance of love. Holding my staff above the snakes, I stood suspended, sorry. That eternal moment was the end of my certainties of self, of body, of Tiresias, man and knowing mind. The coppery glint of their twisting bodies ignited a fire in me, and I struck. Driving my staff between them with all my might, my arm vibrated. The earth shook beneath me, and I staggered forward. My visions opened full circle, encompassing both serpents as they slithered away in opposite directions. A film covered my eyes, and a film covered my eyes, and I fell to the ground, an unbearable tightness enveloping me. Compulsively, I burrowed into pine needles and leaves, into the abrading soil and pebbles and roots beneath, out of my clothes, and still I pushed, as if through my very skin. Now, Manto. His words freeze me. To strike apart serpents of the deep forest? An offense to the goddess of the wilds. No man would dare such in fear of unimaginable consequences. And then Tiresias resumes talking. Exhausted as if I'd fallen into the depths of Hades, I slept. And then I have a dream, which I'm not going to read. When I awoke beneath an innocent blue sky, I feel thrust into the world newborn and stifled an infant's wail. Something was terribly wrong. My body felt strangely light. My hair was longer and fuller. How soft my skin. I'd walked into the woods a man of 3 decades, and now everything about me was altered, younger. I pressed my eyes shut. Let this be a dream. My hand couldn't resist running over my chest, breasts, and my waist, tapering down to a rounded mound opening to woman's subtle organ. A secret, a terrifying transformation. I wanted to pound the earth and shout to the skies, trespasser indeed, step into the mother's garden and he becomes she? I couldn't summon Tiresias' vigor. I sat, a nothing, a hollow. I spoke my name Tiresias in a woman's voice. As Tiresias, I failed my wife and daughters. Now my mind dwelt in a woman's body. Could I call it my mind? So it seemed, yet I was no longer that man. Now back to Manto. I'm speechless. This old man was a woman, yet here he sits male. All is beyond understanding. Many a man has failed as husband and father, but some divine whim picked out Tiresias for a unique fate. That's the end of that transformation. So there's another one later on. I have another little pink marker, but I may or may not read that one. Anyway, oh yeah. Okay, so what brought me to write this, then encouraged me to continue with the storytelling, and I went on another writing retreat to Evia Island in Greece, which was really nice, and also being in those Greek places, I got a lot of atmosphere, and so finally the story got done and told, and I just about used up my time. So I do have a blog, and my website's pretty easy, but I have cards for the book over here, and I encourage you to take one, whether or not get a book. But there are, in my website, super simple. It's just www.jinnywebber.com. It's very simple. And my blog is Greekness Revisited. And I just had one because I wanted to have it be sort of the introduction to this. So I have one blog about storytelling, but I did another one that, so, you know, every so often I'll write a blog. So anyway, I would like to introduce questions, but first I just want to ask, how many of you have been to Greece or the Greek islands or anywhere? Okay, a goodly number. All right, so you know that there can be a kind of a magic about it. You know, there really can be. So that's what, if you haven't gone, find a chance. Although there's some problems today in Greece, I have to confess. So, questions. I can read the other transformation scene, but I thought I've been talking enough and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, I'm really curious to know how it ends.
How it ends. That was not easy. No, nothing was actually easy because all of it was problem solving. And I thought what was wrong with the book first was that it was just a chronicle, this and then this and then this and then this. I mean, I know you don't say and then this, but that's how it felt. But now there's enough suspense, but I don't think it's a spoiler to say that it carries Theseus through his life. And then there's an epilogue about Manto. That's not a spoiler. Yes, Kathy.
So it sounds like you wrote this a while ago,
Initially.
and then you came back to it.
And then I came back and rewrote the whole thing.
As I was going to ask,
But it was the same
was it like
story.
a full-on rewrite,
Yeah.
or was it okay?
Yeah, pretty much. I
Yeah.
had the original.
Because you had a different
worked
take
with
on it, right?
Right. I kept it all. You know, I didn't even have it. I had to take floppy disks to Bill's copy shop to have a hard copy made. That's how long before it was. So they're wonderful. I have a big old thick manuscript. But then a friend stopped over one day and she said, "What is that big stack in your study?" And I said, "Oh, you know, it's a book I wrote." Then I had to put it all into, you know, so it went through a lot of just the process to get it into,
Yeah.
you know, the normal Microsoft Word was not easy. So in retyping it, I redid it. But that was getting that idea of the storytelling that made me reframe what had just been his story, because it made it more interesting. She's not going to be wanting to be his narrator. You find that out early on, like, wait a minute, I have my own life. She's a priestess herself, Manto. She's a priestess of Demeter, and she doesn't feel like she wants to be this. Just we talked into it. Yeah. Okay, Rachel?
Oh, so does Manto carry the story on? Is she telling the story in
She
your version?
she doesn't tell the story, but her story is told in the end. What happens to her? Her son. Luckily, there's all these bits and pieces in this. Her son was also seer, and she was married to a king in some place, kind of in the Middle East or Turkey. I don't know where it would be in modern days, and. Exactly, I didn't look it up. Claros. She was the seer of Claros anyway, so was her son. And all that kind of thing is known. So I wove it in. And then the hardest thing to weave in was the scene from the Odyssey where Tiresias shows up. But I won't tell you that. I mean,
Tiresias is in the Odyssey.
Odysseus does go as a living man into Hades when Odysseus goes when Tiresias is there. He has to go consult him because he can't get home after the Trojan War. You know, in the Odyssey, it's 10 years of being knocked off course. And so how's he going to get home? And I could not for the life of me figure out how to do that scene, but I wanted it in there. So finally I figured out a way.
Thank you.
It's pretty cool that he was still a prophet after death. But then I theorized that once, the way he got to talk to Odysseus, he had to drink blood, and that once he'd done that, he kind of lost his power. So he doesn't keep on prophesying to other people. I kind of brought that part of his life to an end. But yeah.
I don't want to ask you over much, but I was looking for author.
Your other
Someone's else
series
talking.
is set in
Summer, a little louder.
Your other series is set in a different kind of time and place. Where did you get the kind of idea for this book and the?
I talked about it a little bit before you came. I've had this up before. This idea came first, and then the idea for my 3 Shakespearean novels was, what if a girl disguised herself as a boy, because only guys could act on stage, and then she played female roles, and I just loved all the layering, you know, girl playing a guy, playing a girl who disguises herself like Rosalind and As You Like It as a guy. So I got more interested in that type of thing, and I just went with those stories and that character. Yeah, so that's kind of what did it. Just spending more time in England, going to the libraries there and the plays there. And,
Is there a way that
yeah.
if you just look through the science
Yeah.
books, you can find
So
titles?
it sounds like there were a lot of challenges, but I was going to ask you what was the most satisfying aspect of writing a novel?
Oh, the most satisfying was feeling like I really
Is
did
that the
create a
only
person
time?
who could go through all those things. Like, I mean, it didn't come easy. So it made me really happy that I could actually
There's probably
get,
different brain sciences.
I hope, of
Mhm.
someone who felt like a real person that we could actually understand.
Um,
Yeah, the gods talk to
uh,
him. Yeah, there's a lot of fate, and Apollo gets
Yeah.
all kinds of trouble.
Neurological approach.
Who knows why? I don't try to figure out why he's a god, but he can do what he pleases. But yeah, so that was the most satisfying is feeling that that transition from these distant kind of stories that are just odd. Because I really recommend this book, but the stories are totally odd. This couple really love each other, and they turn into rocks so they can be next to each other together. I mean, they're just they're all kinds of weird stories,
Okay,
but
you
they're
don't have
fun
do
to
much
read.
more work. I'll just
Um,
look over there.
yeah.
Okay.
Another question? Kathy, you started to say something.
Well, I was wondering where all your books are, if we wanna buy one.
Oh, behind the
Right
desk.
behind.
They have a couple
Okay.
copies of
Okay,
Bed
great.
Trick, and they have all the
Yes.
rest. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm just gonna read the last
Yeah.
transformation scene then, wrong book, and then we'll call it quits, and if you think of anything else. Okay. So, I thought that something would happen to Tiresias, when I first wrote it, that he would go into an underground cave and have some kind of a hallucinogenic experience with hallucinogens were wild and free around then, and amanita mushrooms, something like that. And I decided against it. There is a scene in the cave, and then he comes out into the daylight afterwards. It doesn't happen in a cave. He comes out from the depths. It's still Tira. I give her the name of Tira. She comes out. I walked into dense and alder and pine woods, no sign of human tread. Why did such an untouched place seem familiar? Half blind in the primeval shadows, I followed the tapping of my staff. He's not blind, it's just dark. You're not yet blind. One step, and I was upon them, two coppery blue snakes knotted together in a love dance amidst gnarled tree roots. With all my womanly strength, I struck my staff between them and held it firm. They arced up each side of the staff, two suspended coils of muscle, heads facing each other like caduceus. I've had a caduceus in there earlier, so like the caduceus sign.
I overworked something.
Then down to earth again. From the spot where I struck burst a multitude of tiny snakes, flashing off in every direction. In the hollow silence, I stumbled forward and fell, earth reverberating as I hit the ground. My last conscious awareness was being swallowed into the abrading leaves. I woke to the sound of a male voice weeping, coming from my own throat. The nest of leaves and pebbles where I fell rubbed me free of all I'd been. I ran my hands down my body and touched my manly part, alien yet decidedly mine. The wind in the woods laughed my name, Tiresias. I could not join the laughter. My manto. My breath catches. For this to happen to Tiresias twice defies understanding. I whisper, why? He speaks. And I use the word chiton because that was more what they wore. Women wore like a tunic, but it was a little nicer. What remained of my chiton was stretched with dirt, he continues, and my golden girdle of Aphrodite lay tarnished. I left it on the ground and shook out the chiton hanging from my shoulders like a man's tunic. Now you know, Manto. Tira didn't die in the cave flooded with mushroom memories, but in the deep woods. My skin felt loose and leathery, my limbs bony. Tira was gone forever. Did any of her beauty and joy remain? My arm was no longer encircled by the golden bracelet, scoured off in the rough underground. Oh, never again would I know such a man. Oh, her boyfriend gave it to her, her guy. I was a man with coarsened clothing. I was now a man with coarsened clothing, no girdle, no bracelet, and no wish to examine my visage. At least the serpent ring remained on my toughened hand. I sighed in relief for that much, but I could make no other sound, even a prayer. Well, I'm happy to sign books and answer any personal questions, and this has been a joy. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you, Jinny.